Now let's go ahead and add addresses to the user, and then we can pass those addresses along when they check out their cart. So in the users module, we're going to go into user endpoints. We're going to add a new endpoint for adding an address. And this is going to need a request that includes all the address information. Right, we're going to move a little quicker than we did in the last module, so I'm just going to give you an overview of what's going on here. You can always check the demo zip file to see all of this code. So we're going to get who the user is off their claim. We're going to look them up. We're going to create a command to add the address to the user. That command is going to be in our use cases folder, so we'll set that up in a second. We're going to send that command, and then we're going to handle the result and just return an OK if everything worked out. All right, so we need an add address to user command. Let's go into use cases for the user now. And in here, we're going to add that class. And it's just going to take in the email address and all the details of the address. Now, I bet you can guess what's coming up next. We're going to add a handler for this command. Now, in this handler, we're going to need a user repository so that we can get their collection of addresses and then add to it and then save it. And we'll have a logger to let us know what's going on. So in the repository, we now need to be able to get the user with their addresses by email. And we don't have that yet, so we'll need to create that. If the user's null, we're going to assume that they're unauthorized. Then we're going to add this address. Then we're going to create a new user address and add that with this method here, which we don't have yet, and then save the changes and then log out what happened. Okay, so we need a new repository method that'll get us the user with their addresses. We need a new address type, and we need a method on user. We also need to add an addresses collection to the user and update our database migrations so that we can persist those. So let's go to users, and essentially we need to do the same thing with which we did for this collection of cart items. We need to do that now, but with addresses. Now these addresses are going to be entities. This is a one-to-many collection, so it's not like on the order where we're just going to add the addresses as a complex property. We need to have an actual separate entity for each address. We're going to call that a user street address, and it's just going to have an ID plus the address value object. We're also going to need a way to add an address to a user and make sure that we don't have duplicates. So in here, we're going to pass in this address value object, make sure it's not null, see if it already exists. If it does, we'll just return the existing one. Otherwise, we'll create a new instance of the entity, and we'll add the new instance to the collection. All right, so we need an address value object and a user street address entity. There's no reason not to use the same record type for this address. It's duplicate of what we have in the order processing module, and that's fine. If we need to change it on either side, we can, but at the moment they need the same thing, so there's no reason not to use the same definition. We could consider moving this into a shared kernel project, which we will have here soon, but I'd be real cautious about doing that with one of these just because the chance that they might evolve separately is probably decent, and I wouldn't want that to be difficult to do because they were using a shared library. Then we're going to add the user street address, and it's just going to take in a user ID and a street address, and you can see all of it right here. Let's put these in their own files. All right, so now all the entity types are correct. We need to update our repository. Let's go ahead and generate a method. So we already had get user with cart. Now we're going to have get user with addresses. Now we just need to implement that on our entity framework repository. It's going to look just like getting it with the cart, but we're going to have the addresses instead. Let's just make these both email just for consistency. All right, so now we have add address. It would probably be nice to be able to list the addresses as well. So let's go ahead and implement that too. This will just need a response. It won't need a request. The response is just going to have a list of user addresses. That'll be a DTO, which can just include the user address ID and the address information. And in here, it's going to look familiar. We're going to use mediator. We're going to fetch the user's addresses endpoint. We're going to take in a claim of email address. We're going to use that to look up the user. We'll pass that along in our query. That's all the query needs, is who the user is, so they can get all of their addresses. We'll send that to our use case where the handler will be, and then we'll map the status back and send the response. So now we need the handler to have this query. And then we want to put this into our use cases for user list address. We'll add a handler. The handler is going to use the repository to go fetch the user with their addresses, and then simply return the addresses mapped to the DTO. Okay, eventually we'll add folders to organize these use cases, but for now this works. Let's see if we can test these endpoints. And of course we still need to add those migrations. So let's do that real quick. And we still need to configure that user street address entity, so let's do that. The important thing here is that we want to use a complex property for its street address and specify value generated never, because we're going to be creating a GUID for its ID. This time it worked. Let's go ahead and update the database. All right, so now we should have addresses in our data model. Let's try again. We got a list of 0 addresses, so that means that's working. Let's go ahead and add an address. Says it was okay. And look, we have an address. Now that we have addresses on a user, when they go to check out, they can actually pass in a real address ID. And we just want to make sure that that address ID is going to get translated into the actual address that is associated with it. So remember, right now, when we go to create a new order, we're just hard coding that address. So we want to set this up so that we have a materialized view on the order processing side that handles getting those addresses, and then we'll fetch the address from that materialized view when we create an order. How is that materialized view going to get updated? Well, we'll cover that as well in the next section.